today we're going to be starting to talk about some complications with the cardiomyocytes or the myocardium, right? The muscles that help the heart contract. And we're going to do just kind of a basic review. So this lecture here that I'm providing you is a shorter basic review of the mechanisms and the electrical events of the cardiac cycle. So I will give you guys little appetizers per se of some old physiology that you may not have visited in a while when we get into these different lectures, because for some of you, normal physiology, human physiology was probably 2 years ago or a year ago. Exercise physiology was probably sooner, but you may not have gone in depth into the physiology. And here we are doing exercise testing and prescription for at-risk individuals. And in order to understand how we prescribe and how we assess and why we assess in a certain way, we got to understand the nature of the disease. We got to understand how the pathology is developing, what is occurring within a cellular level, what's occurring at a tissue level, what's occurring in the rest of the body as a result of this disease. So we're going to start with kind of a bigger scope of what we're talking about. And then we will kind of move into some cellular stuff and talk about what the main mechanism of alteration is and what is occurring and why that's causing the tissue to dysfunction. And then we'll go into some of the concerns that we have to have about people who are exercising, some of the things that we really have to look out for so we don't injure them more. And then we'll get into some of the specifics as how we would assess and then prescribe. So that will kind of be the nature of how we're going to move forward with this information with each and every lecture that we conduct. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about some basic physiology, and let's refresh some memories, and let's kind of get into a little bit of what an action potential is. Now, there are basically two facets of action potential when it comes to cardiomyocytes. We're not going to go into those different types of action potentials, but I just want to kind of revisit what an action potential is, just in case it's been a while. Some of you guys, it might have been a while. You might be like, oh, I kind of remember that, but not really. So let's talk about this. We know that an action potential occurs at a membrane or at a specific cell location where there is a depolarization and then a repolarization of a cell. Okay, so a cell reaches a threshold. In this case, you can see that 96, where's my cursor at? 96 millivolts. We have a threshold here. We know that this depolarization and repolarization is a result of sodium and potassium flooding the cell or exiting the cell. We know that once we reach this threshold, right, this 96 millivolts or 70 millivolts, there's different millivolts for different excitable tissues, we have this depolarization, and then basically we start to go positive into a positive 52 millivolts. Then we have the closing of potassium channels, and we basically have a plateau here, and then we have a repolarization where we basically wait for the next signal to fire. So an action potential is a change in voltage across a membrane, right? And you can see that voltage here, negative 96 to a positive 52. And then we have various changes along the way. I'm not going to test you on this. I'm just trying to give you a basis of what we're going to talk about with some of the cardiopathologies in the next few lectures, right? So you guys know what this is, right? We know that there's a rise and fall in voltage. Action potentials are basically used to send information throughout the body. You guys are very well aware of that as also. And cells that use action potentials are called excitable cells, right? And we see those in neurons. We see those in skeletal muscles, right? We got the motor unit where the neuron communicates with the skeletal muscle. We see that in cardiac tissue or cardiomyocytes. They're excitable as well. We have the cardio pacemaker cells, and we'll talk about those in a little bit of detail today, which are excitable. Also autorhythmic. If you don't know what that term is, we'll talk about that. But we're just going to kind of talk about how electrical impulses are generated in the heart, how they're transmitted throughout the heart, and how that has a direct impact on contraction of the heart. So the reason I'm showing you this is just to be like, hey guys, do you remember this? If not, maybe brush up on it. I'm not going to test you on anything like this slide here, but I'm just making a foundation here saying that there's an action potential. And when it comes to the heart, cardiomyocytes are slightly different in their ability to depolarize and repolarize than other tissues or other types of cells. So let's look at the next slide. So we have two major conduction systems within the heart, okay? Your heart basically beats as a result of the generation and conduction of electrical impulses. You guys are aware of this. Cardiac conduction is the rate at which the heart conducts electrical impulses. And these impulses, they basically allow the heart to contract and relax, all right? So when we have these electrical impulses that are spread out throughout the entirety of the heart, it's going to start in the upper chambers of the heart, which is the atriums, and then it's going to descend down into the ventricles, and the atriums are going to basically contract and relax, and then the ventricles are going to contract and relax. So we have cardiac conduction. This is something you need to know. These are your pacemaker cells. And then we have cardiac contraction, and these are your non-pacemaker cells, okay? So the constant cycle of heart muscle contraction followed by relaxation, right? Why does this happen? Well, this is what causes the blood to basically be distributed throughout the body. So if we don't have cardiac conduction where the pacemaker cells are communicating with each other and sending those electrical impulses across the different chambers of the heart, well, then we're not going to have a contracting muscle as a result. And if we don't have contraction of the muscle, well, then we have blood pooling within the heart. And then we don't have distribution of blood to the rest of the body. We don't have distribution of oxygen to the rest of the body. We don't have distribution of important macronutrients to the rest of the body, nor do we have blood returning to the heart. So we don't have metabolites, we don't have waste coming back, and we have pooling of the blood down in the lower appendages. So any sort of alteration to this very complex system is going to cause systemic complications. So the takeaway here is that it's a domino effect when it comes to dealing with certain diseases. If one thing goes wrong, most of these processes are highly, highly, highly regulated. And if they're highly regulated, that means if one little piece is not acting correctly, that's going to have an impact on the rest of the dominoes, right? So you push one down and they're all going to fall down, right? So cardiac conduction can be influenced by various factors, and that is exercise, right? We know exercise can increase heart rate, increase stroke volume, right? Increase cardiac output. It can increase heart rate by dumping a lot of catecholamines into the bloodstream, and the catecholamines will then basically accelerate the heart. Or if you have a different type of catecholamine, you might... a different type of chemical, you might slow down the heart, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Temperature can increase heart rate, or temperature can decrease heart rate, right? And the endocrine system, which basically can also have a very robust response or impact on heart function and the conduction system, all right? So two major cells that you got to be aware of, or two major components that you got to be aware of, is cardiac conduction and cardiac contraction, okay? We have pacemaker cells versus non-pacemaker cells, and these are kind of cardiac muscle cells, or we call them cardiomyocytes. So let's go into a little more detail on these autorhythmic cells, right? These highly excitable cells that they're really not involved in contraction, but they're involved in generating the electrical impulse that will induce contraction, okay? It's the first step, and then contraction is the second step. So we know that cardiac muscle is made up of the myocardium, right? The muscle, the cluster of muscles that make up the contractile properties of the heart. But we also have these special types of cells, and we have these special types of fibers that are used to conduct the electrical impulse across the chambers of the heart and downward into the ventricles of the heart. These cells are just continuously excitable. They're always on. They're always generating impulses, and they've been doing that since everyone in this classroom was conceived and in their mother's womb, right? So So from the initiation or the onset of your first heartbeat, these excitable autorhythmic cells have been doing their jobs, and many of you guys are in your 20s, so they have been communicating for quite a while now. These autorhythmic cells are responsible for the initiation of impulse generation. It is the first step in cardiac conduction and impulse generation. And the SA node, which you can see here, this is one of those autorhythmic cells. It is referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. All right. It generates the neural impulses that will travel through the heart walls. It is the first it's the first electrical impulse that will fire, and that is the pacemaker cell. Probably the most important of the autorhythmic cells. And the SA node is going to be what causes the atrium, the two left and right atrium, to contract, and it is located in the upper wall of the atrium. I'll show you that in a moment. You guys all know this, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And it's composed of nodal tissue that has the characteristics of both muscle and nerve. So it kind of has a very unique composition where it kind of resembles muscle tissue and neural tissue. All right. So let's take a look at that and see how this looks. And we're going to kind of talk about electrical impulses within steps. And I'm going to refer to this one as the first step, okay, the pacemaker cell. And you can see here I have this heart. Here we can see that in the left atrium we have the SA node, okay. Beneath that we have the AV node. And then we have this yellow line here which kind of represents this conduction system of where those electrical impulses go and how they function and how they operate. So the rate of the SA node is faster than any other autorhythmic cell, and it generates the initial action potential for a normal functioning heart. So the reason I'm showing you this in a course like this is because what happens if we have complications with the SA node and the AV node? And I want you to go back again and think of dominoes. Okay, if I want the dominoes to fall, I got to push one. If I don't want the dominoes to fall, I have to leave it alone, right? So in that analogy, if something were to happen with this SA node, this initiating autorhythmic cell, well, then that's going to impact how the AV node receives information and how that AV node will conduct information down these bundle branches, right? We have these bundle branches here. We have a right bundle branch, we have a left bundle branch, and then we have the Purkinje fibers over here, right? So if these were a series of dominoes, if I push this one down, meaning something is wrong with it, well, then that's going to impact all of these things, right? So it's going to impact heart rate, it's going to impact ejection fraction, it's going to impact ventricle and atrium filling, right? So all these things are going to be impacted by a complication with an SA node, and it basically is going to impact AV node. So if the SA node were to misfire, well, because these three cells are so unique, the SA, the AV, and the Purkinje, they all have the capacity to kind of take over and fire an action potential without the SA node, but it's going to be compromised, right? So these things can operate on their own, but it's going to be compromised. All right. So this is a pacemaker cell, and it's specialized. It's a specialized cell that is basically capable of generating that spontaneous action potential. And again, that's why, let me come down here. That's why I went over here and showed you this, where you can be like, oh yeah, I remember this. Okay. So action potential is going to fire, okay, depolarize, repolarize, and fire again. And the SA node is what's going to do that. On the next slide, much of the same. I kind of repeated most. I already kind of said all of this, but we can look at it. If we want to talk about an SA node that is dysfunctional for whatever reason, if it becomes suppressed, these other pacemaker cells, which is the AV and the Purkinje fibers, they're capable of generating that same spontaneous action potential, but it will be at a slower rate. All right. So there's going to be a little bit of dysfunction in that particular case as the as the SA node becomes dysregulated. So If the SA node was acting alone, if this was the only thing kind of doing the work, we would have a very irregulated heartbeat, which means we would also have a very irregulated distribution of blood to the rest of the body. So, yeah, so that's basically it on the SA node. The only other thing that is really kind of important is this first one here. The SA node fires faster than any other pacemaker cell, okay? And it fires faster, and before it activates the AV node, you can see that here, right? So when the SA node fires an impulse, you can see that that impulse travels over here to the right, okay? And then it travels downward. So why the heck is this impulse going over here? I'm going to give you guys a second to kind of think about that. Why do we have it here and here? And why is there a delay? So if it fires the impulse here, and then it fires the impulse down, if we think about where it's located, right? It's in the back of the right atrium, right? It's near the superior vena cava here. Think about that location and think about this branching out here. Why this is happening. And I'm going to give you guys a second to just kind of think about that for a moment. So it happens so that the atrium on the left and the right-hand side can both contract simultaneously, right? If we didn't have this avenue here where the impulse was traveling into the right atrium, we wouldn't have contraction here and contraction here simultaneously, right? So we want the contraction of this part and this part to be in unison with one another. Now, the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that there is about 1/10 of a second delay between the SA node's message received by the AV node, right? So there's a delay here before the AV node will contract, all right? So message is sent here, message is sent here. We know that the heart can basically generate these impulses without any influence from the central nervous system or neurons. Yes, the central nervous system can influence the heart, but if I were to rip your heart out of your chest right now and we were to just basically look at it over Zoom, right? We're all just kind of looking at it. Guess what it would do? It would still contract. So even though the tissue, even though the organ was removed from your body and there's no other influences, right? Temperature, central nervous system, endocrine system, nothing else is influencing, that thing would still beat in our hands because these things, these autocrine cells, they can generate the impulses on their own, right? So the reason there is a delay once this information is received by the AV node is because the AV node is going to send that message down to the ventricles for the ventricles to contract. So we want there to be a delay between the contraction of the atrium and the ventricles, right? So kind of keep that in mind. That's a very, very, very important thing to think about. So let's move on to the next slide. So I wanted to kind of talk about this internodal pathway, which is what I just kind of showed you here. Let me go back to this last slide, right? We have these pathways here, and we got to talk about that for a little bit, just to kind of make sure we understand the really important parts here. These basically lie on the right side of the partition that divides the atrium, right? So we can see, where is that partition? Here's that partition here, okay? We can see that these pathways, look at here, here's the SA node. We can see that these internodal pathways are right here. They connect, and then they can carry over into the other part of the cells there. They conduct impulses from the left atrium, right, to the left atrium, I'm sorry, and it's supplied by the SA node, right? So this is how that information gets over here. So we have contraction over here. So not only do these pathways travel within the right atrium and the left atrium, but they also form direct points of communication between the SA and the AV node, right? So you can see here that we have the SA and we have the AV. And you can see that these internodal pathways, and I'll just go back to the other one so we can kind of look at what we just saw here. Here we go. Same thing, right? Internodal pathway, right? There it is, the exact same thing. Basically, it allows these different excitable cells to communicate, and it allows that impulse to travel into the other section of the heart. So, yeah, that's what those are. All right, so how are we feeling right now? Is this making sense? Is it coming back to you? Are you starting to memorize all this? Are you bored? Do you need a snack? If you're going to get a snack, you might as well get me a snack too, because I've just been talking into this microphone for, it just seems like days since school has started. Lots to record, lots to profess and to give you guys. So yeah, we'll just kind of keep going here. So if the step one was the SA node, then the step two is going to be the AV node, and that's right here, okay? So let's just kind of look at this slide. So we know that the action potential is generated here. There's a slight delay so that the atrium can contract and push blood out. And then this is a faster autorhythmic cell than the AV node, right? We know that if for some reason this guy wanted to take a coffee break and just kind of stop working for a little bit, he's overworked, he's underpaid, he's underappreciated, well, what's going to happen then is this guy here and the Purkinje fibers can take over, but we'll have a dysregulated heartbeat, right? And we know that whenever we're talking about pathology, if one thing goes, everything else begins to go as well, right? So we know that the AV node is then going to receive the message from the SA node, and it's going to send it down to these bundle branches here, right? So it's going to go through the bundle of His, right, which is this guy right here, which is going to then be divided into the left and right bundle branches, right, which is you can see here. And then that message is going to basically be communicated to the Purkinje fibers, and then we're going to have contraction here and here. All right. We know that the AV node is also located in the right atrium. And the AV node receives the message through these internodal pathways. Again, just making sure you understand that. And then it's going to basically allow for blood to move from the atrium to the ventricles, okay, before the ventricles can contract. All right. So that's what this design allows us to do. So step one. Step two, we have this intermittent step here where we have these internodal pathways here. And then after the AV node receives the information, it's going to fire it through the bundle of His and down to the bundle branches to the Purkinje fibers. Let's look at just a couple more things here with the AV node. Super, super, super important. When the AV node fires its signals to the bundle branches, these things here, the right and the left, why do you think it splits to the right and left? Why is there a right and left bundle branch? Well, because they help the action potential get to the ventricular myocardium, right? So that's the muscles around here. Look at where they're at. They basically surround and encompass those contracting muscles, right? And that way, this signal is basically going to be the green light for the ventricles to contract, all right? So when we get to the bundle of His here, the bundle of His turns into these branches, right? And then these branches terminate here at the Purkinje fibers, okay? So there's three different parts after the AV node. The bundle of His, the right and left branches, and the Purkinje fibers. And then this action here is going to stimulate that ventricle contraction, okay? And it's something that's super, super interesting about this design. If I want you to think about this for a moment. Why do these excitable tissue, these excitable autorhythmic cells, why do they come down and around, okay? Down and around. So if we think about what the atrium does, the atrium is going to basically send the blood downwards, right? So when it contracts, when the SA node fires, and as the signal goes into the left ventricle, atrium and the right atrium, and then it uses this internodal pathway, well, it's going to tell the muscles around here to contract and to push the blood down into the ventricles, right? That's where that blood's going to go. Now, if this fiber, these excitable cells did not go down and around, and let's just say they were up here, what would happen when the bundle of His and the bundle branches and the Purkinje fibers, what would happen when they fired? It if they didn't have this design right here, it wouldn't contract the muscles to eject the blood upward and out, right? So when we have blood in the left ventricle here, we want to pump it into the pulmonary system to be oxygenated. And then when we have blood in the left ventricle here, that is what we use to eject it out to the aorta and to the rest of the body. So we want this blood to move upward, right? And basically interact with the tissue or the aorta where we can oxygenate the blood or we can move the blood throughout the body. So if we didn't have this design here, we would essentially squish the blood down even more, because this design up here in the atrium is designed to squish the blood down, right? And then this design here is designed to move the blood up. And that's why the contraction and these fibers kind of go around this way. So your body is super, super smart, right? Smarter than we are in trying to understand its function. So that is why this design, this kind of netting here, it cups the ventricles and kind of follows the circumference here of the myocardium to push that blood up and out. So really, really, really cool stuff. Okay, and then the last part, right? So we talked about the SA, we talked about the AV. Now we're going to talk about the Purkinje fibers. We know, and I have this picture here so you can kind of see it without the heart. We can get a little more of a clearer picture there. As I said, this signal goes down to the bundle branches, and then we basically fire the Purkinje fibers. So, and then we have ventricle contraction. So I don't really need to read this slide to you because I kind of went over it in the last few. I'm just kind of showing you the steps. You guys can read this one as will, but at your own pace. But I just wanted to show you this picture here where you can see everything really clearly, right? We have the SA, the AV, we have the internodal pathways here. Here you can see clearly the bundle of His. That is going to receive the message from the AV node. And then we have these two different branches, right? And then we are going to have these Purkinje fibers here. And you can see that these like kind of branch out like arms, right? These Purkinje fibers. And that's really important because the more branches they have, the more communication they can have with the myocardium or the ventricle muscles, right? To really create a lot of pressure and a lot of force to push that blood up and outward. So if you look at this design, this top portion here is meant to push blood down into the ventricles, and then this bottom portion here from the bundles of His, you got this netting that kind of goes around the ventricles, and that's meant to push the blood up and out. So very, very cool design, and that's all I really have on these autorhythmic cells. And let's move on. So electrical signaling. Here's where we're going to kind of talk a little bit about exercise too and how the nervous system impacts heart rate. So basically this, I told you, this signaling can happen without any help from the CNS. Again, if you guys don't do your homework and you make me chase you and email you and hound you for work, I might very well rip your heart out. And if I do, we're going to film it and we're going to basically put it on YouTube and just say, hey, here is little Billy's heart. He did not turn in his homework, and let's look at it contract while it is out of the body. So we know that it can contract by itself without the help of the CNS, but the CNS can influence it. Okay, so when we exercise, and let's say our heart is going over 90 beats per minute, which is getting kind of high. Those of you that are exercising on a regular basis and taking care of yourselves and eating well and sleeping well, you might have a resting heart rate of about 50 to 60, maybe 70 beats per minute. Mine, I think right now is at about 57 beats per minute, which is pretty good for my age. I'm starting to turn into an old man over here. And then when we sprint and we run and we jump, we're going to have an acceleration of that heart rate. Heart rate is going to increase under those conditions. And this is where the central nervous system can kind of come in and impact heart rate. So we have the, oh my goodness, sorry about that. Where'd that go? We have the sympathetic nervous system right here, which can play a role in elevating our heart rate. It will accelerate it. And we know how that happens, right? When we exercise, we dump these catecholamines into the blood, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. And they belong to a group of compounds called catecholamines. You guys know this. And and they basically act as neurotransmitters and even act as hormones. So now adrenaline plays an important role in the regulation of sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and you guys know that the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic system that is responsible for, I'm pausing, you guys can say it. Hopefully right now you're mouthing fight or flight mechanism, right? So adrenaline and catecholamines, they play a role in, boom, ramping up your heart rate, especially when you're exercising or there's a stimulus that excites you. And we know that the sympathetic nervous system does that. And so what happens is when the brain kind of perceives this stimulus, which might be running or sprinting, or let's say you're walking in downtown Arcata and a giant brown bear pops out from behind the food co-op, and it startles you and starts chasing you, and you sprint. Well, there's stimulus right there. So when that happens, the brain triggers the hypothalamus to activate the autonomic nervous response. Okay, and when this happens, signals from the autonomic nervous system stimulates the adrenal gland, and that basically starts pumping out epinephrine into the bloodstream. People often refer to this surge of epinephrine as an adrenaline rush, right? So if a bear was chasing you in downtown Arcata, we can safely say that that's an adrenaline rush. So now epinephrine is going to affect the heart muscle and the blood vessels as it's released into the bloodstream. Okay, so once it hits the bloodstream, it is automatically influencing your heart. Okay, and this is going to kind of bring about several physiological changes. So it's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase your blood flow. You guys are going to start to breathe faster. You might have a dump of glucose from your liver into the bloodstream. So you're going to have higher blood sugars. And all of this is going to help you increase physical activity while you're running your ass away from that bear, right? So that is how the nervous system can influence the heart, okay? And then we can also have the opposite role, right? If you're sleeping, you guys, hopefully, unless you're stressed out because of midterms or, my class is stressing you out, you're way under that 90 beats per minute, right? You should have a resting heart rate that is very, very low. So now the parasympathetic nervous system can basically slow down the heart. It can decelerate it. Okay. And in that case, it can basically make the heart pump slower, bring down the heart rate. Okay. And, it can also influence the electrical signaling network, right? So that's basically what I'm trying to show you guys here is that everything that I just showed you can be influenced by the nervous system. All right. And basically how this works is what is the parasympathetic nervous system? What is its mechanism of action for decreasing heart rate? Well, it's going to dump acetylcholine into the blood, and that's going to basically slow down the heart rate. And it does so by binding to these receptors. And then these receptors are basically going to decrease when the receptors receive the acetylcholine message. It's going to decrease the rate at which these action potentials are fired. All right. So that is how the parasympathetic nervous system can slow down the heart rate. Okay. And it's going to decrease the depolarization rate and the speed of conduction at a specific point, which is going to be the AV node. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is going to basically impact the SA node, and the parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow down the depolarization rate of the AV node. Pretty cool stuff, right? So that is how that plays a role. And then here is all of that right here. I basically told you all of it, and there it is. So we can move on. Put this in your notes. You got it. And let's move forward. So now let's talk about basically the cardiac cycle, right? So we've talked about the electrical impulses. So what's going to happen next when we start talking about the cardiac cycle? Well, a complete cardiac cycle that includes every single detail that we've discussed so far basically results in the contraction of the atrium and the ventricle. That's why I'm showing you this, because when we get into our next chapter, we're going to talk about what happens when these things misfire and we have poor contraction and we don't have the right sequence of events that are going to allow somebody to not only function in daily activities, but even, function in an exercise capacity as well. So, and then basically when these contract, it results in the blood being pumped through the heart and into the body and into the lungs and then back to the atria again. And you guys know this, it's a circuit, right? So if the heart is strong, if the heart is operating in its best capacity, this circuit is going to be maintained. We know that the message is going to start at the SA node, and it's then going to be relayed across the heart. Okay, I think that's what we can kind of move on from there. You guys know all of this. I just kind of in repeating myself now. So let's see what the next slide brings us. All right, guys, we're almost done here. I just want to kind of go over this this non-pacemaker cell, and I want to talk a little bit about these contractile properties and just kind of spend a little bit of time comparing and contrasting with skeletal muscle. It's important that we understand both because when we run into heart complications, we can have damage to tissue, right? You can see that here, right? The striated skeletal muscle. Or we can have damage to the vascular system that delivers blood to this tissue. Or we could have arrhythmias with nodal firing, whether it's the AV, the SA, or the bundles of His or the Purkinje fibers. So we have kind of 3 points of attack where the heart can falter. So I really want to kind of talk about some of the components here because these are important components to understand in the disease process. So these fibers here, these contractile fibers, they are not... they do not generate an impulse like the other cells that we were talking about. They have to receive information and be told to contract. So some of the unique features about this type of tissue is if we look here, we can see that this tissue, the cardiomyocytes or the skeletal muscle, this is a single cardiomyocyte. This is a single cardiomyocyte. This is a single cardiomyocyte. And what you can see here is that they're different than skeletal muscle in the fact that they are actually branching, right? So you see how they branch here? And if we have skeletal muscle, you guys know that that's like one long continuous cell. One of the reasons this branching occurs in the heart is because it creates more stability, right? So this heart is constantly filling with blood and then ejecting blood, and it's contracting and relaxing. And then if you exercise, you'll have more blood filling in the atrium and in the ventricles, and then more blood having to be pumped out. So we have to have a little bit of elasticity in this tissue, but we also have to have the integrity of this tissue where it's not going to tear, right? Like a piece of skeletal muscle can tear. So we if we get the heart muscle or the myocardium tearing, that's a bad day for all of us. So one of the reasons it branches out like this is it creates greater strength. It creates this netting that can kind of stand up to the work that the heart does. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here is that these cells they only have one nucleus, where if we have skeletal muscle, we have multinucleation, right? So we can see that there's one nuclei per cell. And then we can see that there's these lines here, right? And these lines are referred to as these discs here, right? And basically these discs are the meshwork that connects, you can see here, cell to cell, right? So we have a connection here to this cell. We have a connection here to this cell. We have a connection here to this cell. So this is going to act as the connecting points that is going to help make this tissue strong as well. So kind of think of the intercalated discs as like stitch work, right? So it's the sewing that was done to make these things kind of come together. Now, another important part of the intercalated discs are these things called gap junctions and desmosomes. We're not going to really talk about the desmosomes right now. I just want to talk about the gap junctions. The gap junctions, as you can see here, right here, these are channels. Think of tunnels, right? That kind of move or that bind cells together so that they can share material, right? So if we have ions or cations in here, or we have sodium, potassium, or we have calcium, whatever, we want to be able to share those materials with other cells within this kind of network that we're talking about. So the gap junctions are going to form these channels to adjacent cardiac muscles. So think of tunnels, right? We have a tunnel here where we can ship material here. We have a tunnel here where we can ship material here. Here are those tunnels right there. You can see that if these two myocytes were connected, those tunnels would be a way of sharing that material. And it also allows the depolarization current that is produced to basically be spread out across the sarcolemma of the cardiac muscle. So these discs and these gap junctions allow the cells to communicate with one another, share materials with one another, make sure that the depolarization occurs in unison, so you have these muscles contracting together, and that's really, really important. So these are kind of the major players of these the cardiomyocytes. Now, there are some subtle differences between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, and we can kind of talk about that. Here is a list of all of that information. You can read that on your own. I'm not going through all this. I took the time to kind of make it for you. You can take the time to compare and contrast. But if we kind of look here, you can see that skeletal muscle has striation, and we can see that cardiac muscle also has striation, right? You can see it here. You can see that the discs and the desmin and the gap junctions are all here, right? We have the tunneling systems. We have the stitching systems. That is not with skeletal muscle, contractile skeletal muscle. We don't see that. We can see that skeletal muscle is multinucleated, where we can see that cardiac muscle only has a single nuclei per myocyte, right? So there's some subtle differences there. Also, cardiomyocytes, they contain transverse tubules, right, and sarcoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria, just like skeletal muscle. When there's an action potential that fires, the sarcolemma is going to depolarize in this tissue and in this tissue. Both of them have T tubules, right? So we know that the sarcolemma is going to be depolarized. That current is going to travel down the invaginations of the T tubules, and then it's going to basically open up the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Both of these have a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So what I'm telling you right now should essentially tell you that both of these will basically use the excitation, coupling, contraction method or process that we've talked about in skeletal muscle, right? So when we have excitation due to the neurons or the SA and the AV node, if you're talking about cardiac muscle, it's going to fire action potentials. We're going to have excitation, and we're going to have contraction and coupling of myosin and actin. So that works in both of these. So when that current travels down the T tubules in this tissue and in this tissue, it's going to activate the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We know that that's where calcium is stored, and calcium is then going to flood the internal milieu of the cell, right? So the cytoplasm of the cell. And then we're going to have what? What is the sarcoplasmic reticulum when it releases that calcium? What does that do? Well, you should be saying that calcium is going to bind to troponin, and it's going to allow myosin and actin to bind and contract and to initiate the power stroke, and we get a contraction. So very similar in that manner. Now, cardiac muscle also contains a lot more mitochondria. Let me see if I actually put that on there for you guys. I don't know if I put it on there, but I'll talk to you about it right now. It contains much more mitochondrium than the skeletal muscle does. And the reason being is because this muscle is activated in the womb of your mother. When you start to breathe and when you start to develop the heartbeat, this muscle is contracting. So it's contracting from when you were born, when you were in the womb to the current date. This muscle has not been contracting since then. This muscle begins to develop more mitochondria when the baby begins to crawl and then when they begin to walk. So this skeletal muscle is far more oxidative than this muscle is, okay? So this one preferentially prefers to use fatty acids and use it through the mitochondria, where this one is can be glycolytic. First, it's preferentially glycolytic, and then it moves into aerobic metabolism, where this one is preferentially aerobic in nature. So because the heart has been contracting so long in your chest, it's just naturally going to have more mitochondria than this one does here. Yeah, so that's basically it, guys. I just wanted to kind of get this video out to you guys just to kind of refresh your memory. And if these are things that you haven't seen in a while, I'm just wanted to kind of put this in front of you because we're going to start looking at how some of these things can go wrong, and then what we can do to kind of help identify and assess the degree of damage, and then start to prescribe exercise to help kind of restore health. So I will get your next lecture to you in a moment, and get ready to watch that, and I will be in touch soon. Thanks, guys.